Yeah, hello, sir. Can you hear me now? Am I
Much
audible?
better now, Rindun. That's
Oh,
fantastic.
thank you, thank you,
Much better.
thank you. Okay, sir. So I'm Sir Parikar, sir. I'm admitting all the participants in the waiting from the waiting room. Okay. A very good afternoon, everyone. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to this international webinar on translation studies across frontiers, jointly organized by the Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies, University of Hyderabad, and Faculty of Arts, Communication, Indic Studies, Sri Sri University. As you know that on 24th May 2017, the United Nations General Assembly has adopted resolution on the role of language professionals in connecting nations and fostering peace, understanding and development, and declared 30th September as International Translation Day, which celebrates the feast of Saint Jerome, the Bible translator, who is considered the patron saint of translators. On the occasion, we feel really delighted to have with us Professor Sameh Hanna, currently associated with United Bible Societies, to deliver a talk on paratexts and reconstruction of a translation field, theoretical and methodological issues. I request Professor Shibarama Parikkal, Professor of Translation, Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies, University of Hyderabad, to welcome our honorable speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Rindam Kundu. Happy World Translation Day to you all. It's an happy coincidence that today, 30th September, which celebrates the feast of Saint Jerome, Professor Sameh Hanna from United Bible Societies is speaking to us. Sameh Hanna is currently with the United Bible Societies to complete a BA funded project. He is currently also working as a visiting faculty with Leeds University, where he was actually an associate professor. He has, for the time being, he has taken leave from Leeds University to complete the project in United Bible Societies. Most probably he would complete it by 2021. Professor Hanna is an associate professor in Arabic literature and translation, Leeds University, UK. His areas of expertise are sociology of translation, Arabic literature, Shakespeare in Arabic, Arabic, Bible in Arabic, and Bourdieu's sociology of cultural production. He was an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow in humanities, University College of London, and founding member of the International Association of Translation and Intercultural Studies, IATIS. He has published a monograph titled Bourdieu in Translation Studies, the Socio-Cultural Dynamics of Shakespeare Translation in Egypt. Indeed, a very, very interesting book published by Routledge in 2016. He has co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Arabic Translation in 2019. It's a very, very happy coincidence that today he is speaking to us, and I very warmly welcome Professor Sameh Hanna on behalf of University of Hyderabad and Sri Sri University. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Padikal. I wonder if you can still see me because I cannot see myself now. It seems that my video disappeared. I can see the slides, but my video disappeared for some reason.
But sir, we can very much see you.
Right, fantastic, because I cannot see myself. I just see the slides. That's absolutely fine. Thank you so much, Professor Padikal and Rendon, for extending that invitation to me. It gives me a real pleasure to be part of this event. I have been following the series of webinars, very successful, very engaging, and I do congratulate you on the success of this event. And again, let me extend the congratulations for the International Translation Day. So happy day for all translators and all scholars working in this field. Just a minor correction about the introduction. My main association, my main affiliation is with United Bible Societies now, where I work as a Bible translation consultant. I am still based at Leeds University as a research fellow. As Professor Padikal said, just to complete a project which has been funded by the BA around the social history of the translation of the Bible into Arabic. Right, that will take me to the topic of my presentation today, which is a topic that I think fits nicely to the main topic of the series of these webinars. The main theme of the webinars have been around this idea of crossing frontiers, crossing boundaries. And what I will be trying to share with you today is crossing frontiers at a number of levels. Crossing the frontiers of text and textuality, going beyond the text into what the French theorist Gérard Genette called trans-textuality. I will say a few words about that. And I will focus specifically on one category of trans-textuality, which is paratextuality. But also my presentation will touch on crossing frontiers at the level of the discipline, our own discipline, at the disciplinary levels. So we'll try to cross the field into some other fields, specifically the field of the sociology of cultural production, to see the connection and the synergy between translation studies on the one hand and sociology of cultural production on the other. And this is why I chose this title, Paratexts and the Reconstruction of a Translation Field. And as I'll say later, the concept of a field of translation comes from the sociology of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. So let me go straight ahead to my presentation. I expect that my talk will continue for around 1 hour, more or less, and then I'll be delighted to have some questions and comments from you. So generally speaking, this is my agenda for today. This is what I'm trying to share with you. I'll say a few words about paratextuality. I've been working on the concept of paratext for a number of years now, but it's only recently that I started to reflect on the theorization of paratextuality. Where does the concept come from? What kind of theoretical challenges are involved in it? And what kind of methodological issues when it comes to applying it to translation? What kind of problems and challenges we expect to encounter? I'll say a few words about the synergy, the interface between paratextual analysis and sociological analysis. And I'll move directly to case studies. I have a number of case studies. I hope that I'll have enough time to share all of them. If not, I'll just share a couple of case studies to show what I mean by this synergy between paratextual analysis on the one hand and sociological analysis on the other. Before I start, a few key assumptions that motivate my presentation. The whole of my presentation are premised on a number of theoretical assumptions. First of them is sociological analysis of any given translation endeavors to reconstruct the network of relationships between translation as both a product and a process, and the human agents who in different ways contributed to its production, dissemination, and consumption. So for any sociological study, you need to think
Professor
about...
Sameh, Hanna,
Sorry. Go ahead, Rendon.
Can you please share your screen?
Oh, I thought it is shared now. That's what I thought. Oh. So you couldn't see it from the very start.
No.
So let me try again. You could have alerted me, Rendon. That's fine. Let's try again. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Let me move the presenter's view and give me the thumbs up if you can see the screen.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Fine.
Fantastic. Yeah. Yes. So we are still early in the slides. You haven't missed a lot. So these are the key theoretical assumptions on which my presentation is based. First assumption is about sociological study of translation. What is it? What is it all about? For me, the sociological analysis of any translation case is all about reconstructing a field, reconstructing the network of relationships between the translation we are trying to study, the producers of translation, of this translation, and the consumers of this translation. This is what we do in sociological analysis, very generally speaking. Second assumption is paratextual framing of translation provides a key analytic tool in reconstructing these relationships. Front covers, blurbs, titles, subtitles can tell us an awful lot of information that we can use in reconstructing our own field. Third assumption, clues to the relationship between translation as both process and product, the producers and consumers of translation, are embedded in paratextual framing. So we can read some clues on the front cover, on the preface, on the titles and subtitles, and the job of the sociologist is to try to make sense of these clues. If I am to visualize these assumptions, if I am to visualize the whole of my presentation, I will just represent it like that. And it's always a risky business to try to represent translation visually. So this is what I'm trying to talk about here. We have a very complex relationship between the text of translation, its producer, the gatekeepers who allow specific translation and its producers into a specific field, and then we have the consumers of this translation. And of course, what I'm trying to share with you here is that Paratext can tell us an awful lot of information about all of these categories. On the front covers, on the blurbs, we can deduce some information about the producers of translation, about the very text of the translation, about the gatekeepers, and about the consumers of translation. The risk here in this visual representation is that it projects translation in some simplistic way. The relationship between producer, text, and gatekeepers and consumers is not that linear. It's much more multifaceted, much more complex than that. This image is just for representing visually what I'm trying to share with you. Right, so let's say a few words about the category of paratext. Where does it come from? Let's try to locate it in a context, its own theoretical context. As we all know, as most of you know, the context comes from the work of the French theorist Gérard Ginette, who died quite recently, a couple of years ago, 2018. And quite ironically, 2018 was the same year where we have a key publication in our field, which is inspired by the work of Ginette, which is Translation and Paratext by Bachelor. That's a key text, that's a seminal text. Of course, we did have some scholarship before this book, but that's the full-length study of Paratext, try to theorize it, reflect on the methodological issues and challenges involved in applying it, and so on and so forth. So let's say a few words about Girard Genet. Girard Genet was a structuralist. He had an interest in the study of literature, the literary text, but his main interest was in the relationship between the literary text and other texts around it, and other factors which make the reception of the literary text feasible and viable and valid. And that will take me to another key work, another key book by Genet, which came before his main book, Paratext, which is Palimpsest. Palimpsest was published back in early 1980s, in which he tries to talk about this notion of transtextuality or textual transcendence, or as I've said earlier, this act of crossing the frontiers of text into something beyond the text. So he does reflect on this act of crossing these relationships between the text and other text beyond it. So for him, transtextuality is everything that brings the text into relation with other texts. And this relationship can be either explicit or implicit. I'll say a few words about the types of transtextuality which Girard Genet talked about in his own work. We will not necessarily use this in our case studies, but just to be aware of different forms of transtextuality. He reflects on intertextuality, which is basically the presence of a text in another, the relationship between one text and another. Metatextuality, which is one text commenting on another without necessarily having to quote it, but explaining it, explicitating it, commenting on it. Hypertextuality is another form of transtextuality. And hypertextuality is one way of grafting the text on another earlier text. We're not here quoting one line or one paragraph or quoting one image, but one text is being inspired by another text in the past. Probably, we have many examples here, but one example that comes to my mind for those of you who study contemporary British drama, a well-known British playwright is Tom Stoppard. He has a play called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. This whole play is grafted on another play by William Shakespeare, which is Hamlet. So you cannot make sense of this play without reading Shakespeare's play. So there is a hypertextual relationship between Tom Stoppard's play and Shakespeare's Hamlet. The fourth form of transtextuality, which was developed by Girard Genet, is architextuality, which is the relationship between the text and the genre, or the discourse, or the tradition of text to which that text belongs. The fifth form, which is the object of our presentation today, is paratextuality, which is the relationship between the text and other verbal or non-verbal frames that mediate it to the reader. Of course, one methodological problem that we might have time to talk about later is when we apply that to translation studies, probably we need to expand on the very notion of textuality and paratextuality. Because the questions here are, how can we apply this concept to interpreting? In interpreting, we don't have text. How can we apply that to audiovisual translation? So the very concepts of textuality and paratextuality probably need to be expanded on when we apply them to translation. A few observations about this typology developed by Girard Genet. We have some degree of overlap between these forms of transtextuality. They don't function independently. They work side by side with each other. So for example, metatextuality may sometimes have intertextual elements in them. When you have a work of criticism reflecting on or writing on a literary text, you might have some form of intertextual allusions in this meta text. Another example, intertextuality may perform a metatextual function, for example, quoting an author in order to comment on his or her assumptions or arguments. You quote an image, a line of verse, or a paragraph in order to perform a metatextual function, in order to say something about this author and their own work. Hypertextuality may be determined through paratextual elements, book covers and prefaces and all of these things. Architextuality, the relationship between a text and a genre, may be determined through paratextual elements. So all of these forms of transtextuality, they are interdependent. Not only that, they're not only interdependent, but they are synchronous. They can function simultaneously. Just one example I can share with you is the paratextual framing of well-known novel which was published a few years ago, The Hours by Michael Cunningham. And that's a novel, that's a very interesting novel, because it is inspired by the whole work of Virginia Woolf. You will not be able to make sense of that novel without being aware of the world of Virginia Woolf, where she comes from, what are her main themes, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the front cover, if you look at the blurb of this novel, you can, so these are paratextual frames, but you can read into them a number of information through other transtextual elements. So you can see how this novel fits within the architext of novel writing by just looking at the subtitle, a novel. So that gives you an indicator. That's a sign for the reader that tells them you need to make sense of that piece of writing within the parameters of novel writing. So there is an element of architectuality here. If you look at the blurb, for example, you can see from what is being written. I hope that you can read what is written on the blurb. You can see a few elements which establish some intertextual relationships between that novel, The Hours, and the work of Virginia Woolf. Also, if you look at the front cover, you can know that this novelist, his work has got him the Pulitzer Prize. And that piece of information will definitely shape your own reception of that novel, and so on and so forth. So this is one example that shows us that all manifestations of transtextuality, they are interdependent and they can be synchronous. Just a few theoretical reflections on that category of paratextuality, because sometimes we can miss the complexity of that category. Sometimes we may tend that the paratextual elements, the paratextual frames are meant to establish clear boundaries between the text and the world outside the text. But actually, Jeanette and many other scholars were aware of the complexity and the paradoxality of that concept. I'm just quoting here from Jeanette, the very first page of Palimpsest, where he quotes another well-known American literary critic, Hillis Miller, talking about the complexity of that notion of paratextuality. I'm not going to read the whole quotation, but just, he says that paratextuality, it is something which is simultaneously refers to what is to this side of a boundary line, the threshold or the margin, and also beyond it. It's equivalent in status and also secondary or subsidiary, submissive, as a guest to a host, slave to a master. So that notion tells us something about the relationship between the reader and the text. The reader is somebody like a guest standing outside a house, standing outside that threshold, and the guest is waiting to step inside that house. This is one way that you can look at it. So the view from outside, but also you can look at paratext from the inside. The paratext is tells you about the way the producers of the text want to shape the reception process of the readers. It tells you something about the clues that the producers of the text give to that guest before they welcome them into the house. So there are two sides of paratextuality. From the point of view of the consumer of the text, the reader of the text, and you can look at it from the point of view of the producer of the text, what kind of messages they want to pass on to readers, and so on and so forth. If you go to the bottom of this quotation, Paratext is also the boundary itself, the screen, which is a permeable membrane connecting inside and outside. It confuses them with one another, allowing the outside in, making the inside out, dividing them and joining them at the same time. That makes our thinking about paratextuality quite profound, because it simply tells us it's not a clearly identifiable boundary between the text and its consumer, but you can see it as he says in this quotation, as something connecting and joining. We can see the similarity between the receivers of the text, the producers of the text, and we can see the differences at the same time. The metaphor used to represent paratextuality is quite telling. The whole idea of a threshold, the threshold dividing the house from those who are outside the house, or the idea of the vestibule. The vestibule is a small space. Once you enter into any house, as a guest, you stay in the vestibule. You are not yet into the main living area of the owners of the house, but you are starting to know the house from the inside, right? So you are a guest, but at the same time, you can see some hints of what is indoors. And these images are quite telling. Now, as I've said, this concept has been inspiring to a number of scholars in different branches of the humanities. And this is including translation studies. We have seen many studies in the last decades, at least, chapters, journal articles, trying to investigate the implications of that concept. And quite lately, you have seen the seminal book by Bachelor, trying to theorize the idea that Jeanette refers to in his two books, Palimpsest and Paratext. He talks about paratextuality as both a transition and a transaction, and I like that. And that again serves to complicate our understanding of paratextuality. It's a transition, of course, going from the world of the reader into the world of the producers of the text. So there is some transitory moment, there is some act of crossing here. But at the same time, there is some act of transaction. The producers of the text allow the receivers, the readers, to go into the text on their own terms. There is some form of transaction, of a contract. The clues and cues the producers provide on the paratextual framing are just the terms of this transaction. These are the terms of the contract on the basis of which the readers are invited to make sense of the whole thing. Before I talk about translation studies, just to give you one example about how important, how fundamental paratextual framing is for the process of reception. This is an image of the first edition of Ulysses, the well-known novel by James Joyce, right? As you can see, the front cover is quite plain, bland, no images, no visual representation whatsoever. All we have is a title. And this title in itself serves as a paratextual framing that structures the process of reception. Just imagine that novel without that title. How difficult that how difficult would it have been for that dense and complicated and multi-layered novel to be made sense of, to be interpreted and read? It's only this one single title that takes the mind of the reader to the work of Homer, to the Odyssey, and the reader can easily make the link between the current work, Joyce's novel, and the reference that is being made to Homer's poem. Without that, the process of reception would have been quite difficult. Let me go so quickly now to the functions of Paratexts. And these functions, they differ across time and they differ across different textual cultures and different, if I can say, paratextual cultures. So across time, the function can be different. The function of paratextual framing in manuscript cultures in the past, in the medieval age, there was no book industry. Writing communication was only through manuscripts. The predominant culture was manuscript culture. The function of the paratext, the illustrations, introductions, was definitely different from the functions of paratext in book culture, in print culture. The functions of paratext across cultures at the same time can be quite different. And we can talk about specific details here, even the use of the font, the shape of the font, the size of the font, the significance of colors in different cultures, how they are used in different front covers, blurbs, different ways of writing prefaces and introduction. These are all different across cultures. One theoretical / methodological issue that faces us when we try to make sense of Junaid's work is how he viewed translation. And this is something that Catherine Bachelor engages with in her book. Because in Junaid's work, he looked at translation as itself a paratext. He viewed translation as some kind of a text that comments on the source text. It is not a text on its own. And that poses a problem for us translation scholars. And this is why Catherine Bachelor and many other scholars had to engage with that idea. Since the 1980s, since the descriptivist turn, we have all started to view translation as a text in its own right, that plays and performs its own functions in the target culture. So it's not auxiliary, it's not secondary. So it is a text on its own right, and a text with its own paratext. And this is what we need to engage with. In Bachelor's work, I really encourage you, if you want to, if you are really interested in the study of paratextuality in connection with translation, you need to have a look at this seminal publication. And Bachelor in this book charts the different lines of research that can be followed when studying paratextuality in connection with translation. One of them obviously is the paratext of translation. What kind of paratextual framing we use when we produce translation. Another line of research is the translation of paratexts. So we have one preface written, for example, in a recent Arden edition of a Shakespearean text. And this preface needs to be translated into Urdu or Hindi or Arabic. What happens when we translate this paratext? Will we have any changes? Will we have any transformation in the process? These are important research questions. But one other line of research that really interests me, that connects with my own background, and that's the use of paratext to build. This is how Bachelor calls it, to build a tradition of translation, a translation tradition. Or to use Bourdieu's terminology, how can we make use of paratext to reconstruct a translation field? And this is how I would like to use paratextuality to connect it with my own work about the sociology of translation. So now I'll leave paratextuality aside and I'll try to say a few words about what it means to reconstruct a field of translation. If you have done some reading into sociology of translation a la Bourdieu, you will understand what I'm talking about, but I'll just say a few words about that. Bourdieu didn't write much about translation apart from one article towards the end of his life, but his work about the sociology of cultural production has been inspiring to many, as we all know. And he viewed any process of cultural production in terms of this key metaphor, this key image of the field. And he used it in different senses, in different meanings, talking about a playing field where you have different players competing with each other over victory, over capital. Sometimes he used the concept of market. Again, different producers of culture competing with each other over dominating the market. So he uses that notion of field, which I use in my own work on the translation of Shakespeare and later on the translation of the Bible into Arabic, trying to reconstruct that field. Now, the methodological question is, what's in a field? What does a field involve? What do we need to think about when we reconstruct a field? A number of things for me. We need to think about the field structure. Who are involved in that field in terms of the agents, the producers, the consumers, and the institutions which have some stake in translation. And then we need to talk about the dynamics of the field. How does that field function? How does it keep moving on? How does it work? What are the key principles on the basis of which that field works? And then in order to reconstruct a field, you need to look at the interface, the synergies between that field and some other fields. Say a few words about these without going into much detail. First of all, a few words about the structure of that field. What do we have in a field? What's in a field? Using Bourdieu's terminology, we have a number of things. We have what Bourdieu calls positions. That's a confusing term, and that's why I prefer the term options. Producers of culture in any given field, they must be given some options. Things to choose from. So in the field of literature, the options can be different themes, different motifs, different genres, different ways, modes of production. So in the field of drama translation, for example, we can talk about translating for the stage or translating for the page. These are all options. And then in the field, you need to have producers and co-producers, and that's important. And you might have noticed that I'm using the word here in the plural. And that rings bells for us translation scholars when we think about translation, because for a long time we used to think that any translated text has been produced. This end product is down to one individuality, which is not really the case. If we think about translation sociologically, we can think about different producers, different agents, the front cover designer, the writer of the blurb, those who write the forewords and the prefaces and the introductions. These are all producers and co-producers. We need to reconstruct them, to think about them. Also in a field, you need to think about the what Bourdieu calls doxic practices, or the presupposed ideas. Some givens, some ideas and notions and probably codes of practices that translators take for granted. They don't think about them. And on the basis of these presupposed ideas, the field functions, they can produce their own work. So that these are the elements that you need to think about when you start reconstructing a field. I've just explained that, so I'll skip this. And these two. Also in a field, something that I'll say a few words about that. When you think about the producers and the co-producers of translation, one other thing that you need to reflect on is the trajectory of these agents in that field and in some other fields. And by the trajectory, I mean their own development. What kind of translations they have been producing in the past, whether or not they are active in some other fields of activity. Some of the translators that I have been studying, they did have some other jobs. They themselves produced literature. They translated within some other genres. So you need to be aware of the trajectories of these translators. I've mentioned presupposed ideas. One key idea that you need to know about the presupposed ideas or these givens, the ideas that producers of translation take for granted and they don't think about when they produce translation. Probably the closest word to this concept is that concept that comes from Gideon Toury, the norms of translation. Norms are unconscious. We do our work without thinking consciously about these norms. They are part and parcel of our own mindset, our own habitus, to use Bourdieu's word. One thing that Bourdieu says, which is quite helpful in reconstructing the field of translation, is at some point in the history of any field of translation or any field, these presupposed ideas, there comes a moment when some key players, some translators in our case, they challenge these presupposed ideas. And Bourdieu has a very nice expression to express this idea. He says, these key players, they break the silence of doxa. All of a sudden, they show up and they say, well, these norms are not working anymore. These givens, they are not functioning anymore. We as translators, we need to change our ways of thinking about translation. Yeah. And that is why we have two types of discourse. We have the defenders of the status quo. They become aware of these unconscious norms and they embrace what Bourdieu calls an orthodox discourse. They defend these presuppositions. They don't want to change them. And on the other hand, the new troublemakers, if you like, the newcomers to the field, they embrace what Bourdieu calls the heterodox discourse. And at some point in the field, before it develops and changes, you have a conflict between these two types of discourse, the heterodox and the orthodox. And this is what happened in my case in the history of the translation of theater in Egypt towards the second decade of the end of the second decade of the 20th century. That takes me to the reconstruction of the dynamics of the field. So you reconstruct the contents of the field, the structure of the field, but you also need to reconstruct the principles on the basis of which this field functions. And again, we get some inspiration from Bourdieu here. He talks about this notion of struggle, conflict. And this conflict can be between translators or producers of translation who are very much profit-oriented. They are after money, making money out of translation, and others who are prestige-oriented. They are not after profit. They are after canonization. They want their own work to be canonized, to be anthologized, to be seen and read by many people without necessarily having to make money out of it. But the struggle can take other forms. It can be, as I've just mentioned, a tension between the old guards in the field, if you like, and the newcomers. At some point, you have a new generation of translators trying to establish new norms, new ways of doing things. So you have a tension here. On top of that, on top of the structure and the dynamics of the field, in order to reconstruct the field of translation, you need to think about the synergy between that field and some other fields of activity. Because some practices and some changes in the field, it would be quite hard to interpret, to describe really, without thinking about other fields of activity, which are not necessarily related to translation. So in my case, for example, my object of analysis is theater translation. But in my study of theater translation in the 19th and 20th century Egypt, I cannot avoid looking at the field of literary translation, because there is some kind of interface, some kind of synergy. I cannot avoid reflecting on the field of pop culture, production of singing and dancing at that time, because that field shaped how the translation of theater happened at that time. So these are the three elements that you need to think about when you reconstruct the field. Time for case studies. We've been talking theory for some time. I'll just say a few words. Rendon, if you like, if you want to give me a signal if you think that I'm going well beyond my time. Because I have a number of examples. At some point, if you think that I'm doing too much, I'm over talking, just stop me. Okay?
Okay.
Right. Just first example, I'll go back in history and I will share with you, and that's in my book, first case of an Arabic translation that we know of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Right? And this is the front cover. Again, quite plain, nothing visually sophisticated about it. No colors, no drawings, nothing. It's only some kind of verbal clues and cues by the translator, probably the publisher, which tell us something about how these producers see translation and how they invite us to step beyond the threshold of that front cover and make sense of that text. So let's read the elements on this front cover. I've just glossed these for you here. We have a number of things. And the sociologist's work, the sociologist's job is to try to read into these little clues because they are important for reconstructing the field. That's a glaring example of how paratexts can be quite useful in reconstructing the field of translation back in history. That's a translation that was published in 1902. It was put on the stage a year earlier. And as a social historian of translation, I have nothing but to try to read into these paratextual frames. What do they tell me about the field at that time? A number of things. First of all, the word used in Arabic to establish the genre to which this translation belongs. What's the word that this translator used? Until that time, the Arabic word that we use nowadays for theater, which is masrah, it wasn't known, it wasn't frequently used at that time. And it seems to me that the translator was struggling to try to establish a relationship between that text and the architext, if you like, the genre or the tradition of text. To which tradition should it belong? He was struggling. And that's why he used an Arabic word for another genre. The word riwayat or riwayat in the Arabic language, it simply means narrative or novel writing. It doesn't mean theater. So he was struggling to try to categorize it, to put it under a category, to put it within a tradition. That paratextual information helps me quite a lot as a sociologist of translation to understand what was going on. So until that time, producers and consumers of theater translation did not really understand what theater meant from a Western perspective. Remember that. It's fair enough to say that in the Arab culture, we did have some tradition of performances in the form of street theater, for example, puppet theater, what we call shadow plays, using shadow to represent some form of drama, but we didn't have theater in the Aristotelian sense, right? So this translator was struggling. And then if you move down, how does he think about the source text? A text for acting in 5 acts. So he's aware that this is not a text for reading, but that's a text which is meant for viewing. And that's important. Because remember, this translation was put on stage. It was meant for the stage. It was put on stage a year earlier. And when the translators saw that it was successful, they decided to publish it a year later. How does he see Shakespeare, our translator? Authored by Shakespeare, the renowned English poet. This is striking. He doesn't see Shakespeare as a playwright, as a dramatist, but he thinks of him as a poet. And that again should make me think about the structure of theater translation at that time. Shakespeare for him was not the master of drama, conflict between characters. He was not the master of plotting a series of events and developing them into a climax and then a resolution. They didn't look at him in these terms. But for them, Shakespeare was the master of rhyme, rhythm, and poetry. And if you look at the translation, you can see that aspect quite clearly. The translation was done in verse. It was poetic. The dramatic tension was put in the background for the sake of highlighting the poetry of Hamlet, not the dramatic action in it. And then if you move down on the front cover, he says, he uses a term for the translation strategy he used. What term is that? He didn't use the Arabic word we use now for translation, which is tarjama in the Arabic language. He used the word Arabization, Arabized. And that's again very interesting. What does that tell us? When we look at the text, he thought of Arabization as an act of domestication, making the text feels and sounds and smells like an Arabic text, right? Getting rid of the Britishness and the Elizabethan culture of the text and making it a radically, significantly Arabic text. That's important. This is how they understood translation. And of course, as we'll see later, this translation was very successful. No one came out to criticize the translator and tell him that your translation is rubbish, this is an act of treason, you are a traitor, and so on and so forth. Because at that time, these were the principles on the basis of which that field functioned. And that's why it would be quite a mistake. I will show you some comments from later historians of Arabic drama. They couldn't think historically of these cases. They couldn't read the clues on the paratext frames in order to be able to reconstruct the field. But they judged that translation from their own perspective in their own time. And the outcome is kind of disastrous. I will show you later. On the same front cover, how does he describe himself? Not as a translator, but as a writer, as an original author, not as a copier of Shakespeare's text, not as a representer of Shakespeare's text, but as an author, as somebody who rewrites the whole text. Move forward. Some paratextual information about the author himself. So now we saw some information, we could read some information from the front cover. And this is one type of paratext, which we sometimes call the peritext. Two main subgroupings of paratext are the peritext, which are the frames which are within or closer to the text, and what we call epitext, which are paratextual frames which are remote from, distant from the actual text. like information about the author, an interview that the author or the translator gave after the translation. That's an epitext, if you like. So I kept researching this translator for some time until I found out that he was also a poet, Tanius Abdu. He was a minor poet, not well known, but there was an anthology of poetry which was published later, after his death, posthumously. And an inside page, there was a picture of himself. Whoever published this anthology, they put a picture of the translator and a few lines of verse which this translator wrote about himself. And these lines of verse are very telling. From a sociological point of view, from a historical point of view, they are key for reconstructing the field. And it's obvious that the man has a sharp sense of humor. So this is what he says about himself. This is my picture, you see it, say whatever you want about it, it doesn't see you. He's talking to his reader. Do not bother about my upset face, it has been merrier and happier before it saw you. That's funny. And then he goes on to say, my face is upset. And that's the striking line here. From a historical and sociological point of view, my face is upset because I joined a profession where people are destined to look just like that. Wow. So from a historical point of view, from the perspective of the sociology, this line, for me personally, opened me a door for exploration. And it raised a number of questions. One key question is, what were these pressures which made that translator at that time talk about his profession, his work in these terms? What really shaped him? What really stressed him? And talked about the very fact that he is upset, so he looks gloomy because of the kind of professional pressures which were laid on him. That's a very important sociological question. And that leads me to talk about the reception of the translation. And again, you can find some paratextual information in the reception. Things written about the translation, reviews, around its time of production or remotely from it after a few decades, you can see how did this translation navigate its way in the field. So a couple of information here. This translation, when it was put on the stage, it was the only Arabic stage version of Hamlet for over 15 years, which means that it was successful. No other translator dared to challenge this version. In its published form, it went into 2 different editions. So when it was published in print form, it continued to be successful. But what happens in a few decades from that moment? We have a number of changes here. A number of scholars in the 1950s who tried to reconstruct this field, not on its own terms, but on their own terms, reconstructing that field from their own perspective. And the outcome is kind of misleading, as you can see here. So this is one historian of drama translation. And this is what he has to say about this translator of Hamlet. The undeniable fact is that the translator availed himself of all the means of distortion, which he brought to his translation. The translator pioneered a school known for deformation and distortion in translation practice. No story or play he translated was left unchanged. So starting from the 1950s, that man was projected in the history of drama translation as the icon of infidelity. If you want to give readers of history of drama an image of a representative of infidelity, this is your man. So he was the man. I realize I'm running out of time, so I'll just try to skip a few a few slides. If you go into that translation, you can see that there have been some radical changes. The plot has been structured. So in this play, Hamlet was kept alive, and the ghost of his father appears at the very end, and he tells him that you deserve to be kept alive and you need to take back the throne, and so on and so forth. Some theater companies have taken this version and they have added more changes to it. So not only was Hamlet kept alive, but Ophelia was kept alive, and he married them to each other. And the genre of the drama of Shakespeare's tragedy was totally transformed. So instead of a tragedy, in the first Arabic version, it became a musical melodrama. A lot of singing and dancing and a happy ending at the very end. And this is something about the genre itself. When you look at the translations of the monologues, you no longer have the tension between, the inside tension between Hamlet's private self and public self, what he wants to hide from his hearers, what he wants to reveal. That tension is blurred, is removed from the translation, so that the monologues, instead of sounding dramatic, they sound like lyrics of songs. And of course, it won't be surprising if you know that the actor who played Hamlet in that version was originally a singer, and he wanted the monologues to sound like lyrics of songs. Again, if you don't know all of these paratextual information, it would be quite easy to judge this translation on the wrong grounds. It would be quite easy to say this is a rubbish translation, take it out of the archive, it doesn't deserve to be in history, and this is what actually happened. I kept looking for this translation for not less than 3-4 years, and in every single library, even the National Library in Egypt, it was taken out of the archive. It doesn't exist, simply because of the fact that the librarians, the archivers, the gatekeepers, if you like, they simply didn't see it deserving to be part of the historical archive, so they took it out. That's one other example of an ahistorical judgment of the translation, judging it on the basis only of the text, not the paratextual framing of it. I have many other examples. So if you move in history, I'll just mention a few examples and then stop, because I want to get some feedback and some questions from you. So this translation was produced in 1901. A few years later, especially in 1910, 1911, you have a new generation of translators entering into the field. You have some structural change happening in that field. And in order to reconstruct this change, in order to register it and describe it and interpret it, again, one of your key analytic tools is the paratextual framing. Front covers, blurbs, prefaces, notes, whatever was written about translators in the newspapers and the magazines at the time. Just to give you one example of a front cover that I found of one of the earliest Arabic translations of Macbeth that was published in 1911. And the front cover itself, it tells you something about this structural change. There is a new generation coming into the scene now. And you as a sociologist, you need to register that. You need to take note of that. I'll give you the gloss of this translation. There are some elements which are still kept from the previous generation. A translation of Macbeth in Arabic verse. So the predominance of poetry of verse and the priority of poetry over drama, over conflict is still there. So that's one element which keeps going on. Talking about Shakespeare as a poet, again, the predominance of rhythm and rhyme and figures of speech, metaphors, similes is still there. But we have some new elements, very interesting elements. If you move down, Arabized The same word talking about translation strategy is still used, but even this word will acquire new meanings with the new generation of translators. But bear with me. Arabized in verse from the English language, that's important. Why is that translator so keen to say that he rendered his Arabic version directly from the English source text? What does he want to say to us, readers and historians and sociologists? What's the message here? Of course, he's trying to pass on a message that puts himself and his product in a contrastive perspective with the products of the previous generation of translators. It was well known at the time that the early generation of translators translated Shakespeare through French, because all of them were Francophone. Education at that time was dominated by the French educational system because of colonization and some other factors. Starting from late 19th century and moving into the first 2 decades of the 20th century, most of the educational systems in most of the Arab world were started to be dominated by the British education system. So everybody knew English. Egypt was colonized by Britain in 1881, 1882. And since that time, the British had their own impact in terms of education, in terms of culture. So that translator was really keen to say that my product is much better than the product of the previous generation, because simply I'm translating from the source text directly. So the competition between the new generation and the old ones is obvious here. And again, the following line on the front cover is really striking. The dedication. Our Arabization is dedicated to the whole world, including authors, poets, and scholars. So after he says to the whole world, as if he says, hold on, the dedication is not actually for the whole world. This translation is not for everyone. It's for the elite. It's for elite readers. It's for authors, poets, and scholars. That's why down there, if you go down, he's dedicating it specifically to the foreign minister of Egypt at that time. Do we have some paratextual information that we need to take note of? Of course. And does this information have to do with the competition between the old generation and the new generation of translators? Yes, it does. Old generation of translators, their product were mainly targeted at middle-class, mainstream theater goers in Egypt. Not only middle class, but even lower classes, people who are not well educated, who are semi-educated. The goal of these translators was not to educate their own spectators, but their objective was they have more than one objective. First of all, to introduce a new genre, a new art form, but at the same time, their main goal was to make profit out of these translations. So the end product tended to be, using Bourdieu's term, large-scale production. It was commercialized, right? But with the new generation, they are trying to say here, our conceived receivers, our conceived consumers of the translation should be educated. We're not commercializing Shakespeare. We're not producing that for the common readers, but this is meant for well-educated speakers. I'll just mention one example and I'll stop for Q&As. Another example that tells me that the new generation are trying to establish new norms, are trying to challenge the doxic practices, the presuppositions of the old generation. We can see that from different other paratextual framings. This is a translation of Julius Caesar in 1912. And on the front cover of the translation, I couldn't reproduce that because it was totally worn out. the front cover. We have a dedication. Translator is saying this translation is dedicated to all nations aspiring to independence. And it seems we have some kind of a subtle political message passed on this front cover here. And then when you turn over and you go into an inside page, you'll have a picture of Shakespeare, and underneath it, you have this very striking statement describing Shakespeare. William Shakespeare, the English democratic poet and playwright. What does have democracy to do with Shakespeare as a poet and as a playwright? That's an important question that the historian and the sociologist needs to answer. That's a 1912 translation. At the time, Egypt was under British occupation. And now we have a new generation of translators who are trying to say that we are not trying to make money out of Shakespeare, but we are trying to use translation for a more noble cause. We are trying to pass on a political message. It's not about entertaining you, viewers of theater, but it's about mobilizing all the well-educated policymakers and decision makers in this country. And that's why we have this subtle message here. Later on, another translation of Othello. I'll just conclude with this one, and I promise I'll stop here. Yes. Another later translation around the same year, Arabic version of Othello, done by a well-known poet, Khalil Mutran. And for the very first time, we have a translator writing an introduction for a translation. Not much is happening on the front cover, but the very brief, short introduction is telling, and you can use it heavily to retrieve information about the field at that time and try to reconstruct the field. One of the few things he shares with us in this introduction is the change of the meaning of Arabization. Remember, with the first generation, the word had simply the meaning of domestication, adaptation, commercialization, if you like. But with this gentleman, the word, he tried to break the silence of doxa, to use Bourdieu. He tried to question the presuppositions. And this is what he says about Arabization. He says, I approach this play to Arabize it. And then he goes on to say what he means by Arabization, as if I were retrieving it into its origin. And there is something very, very interesting going on here. Before this line, he makes an unjustified argument, of course. He says that his assumption is that Shakespeare must have stolen the story of Othello. And Othello looks like an Arab reader who comes from an Arabic background. So Shakespeare must have stolen the story from somewhere. He might have either read it in Arabic or in translation. And then in the introduction, he says, through this translation, what I'm doing is to take my property, which was taken by Shakespeare, back into its own original soil. So there is something interesting happening here. This hierarchy of original translation is challenged. So all of a sudden, the translation becomes original, and Shakespeare's work becomes the imitation, becomes the reflection, right? And through that, we know that by Arabization, he's not talking about commercialization. He's using the same concept, the same term, to challenge the hierarchy of colonizer-colonized, first world culture and third world culture. So he Arabizes the play itself, the plot, he Arabizes the title, and he says that the very proper noun Othello must have been anglicized from an Arabic proper noun which Shakespeare has deformed, and he comes up with an Arabic name, which until now is still used, which is Utayl, and he uses Utayl. And then he goes a step further, so he Arabizes the name of the hero, he Arabizes the plot, and he Arabizes the author himself. Of course, he goes too far here, but I'm just trying to show you that even the meanings of words have been challenged with this new generation of translators. He says, I can see something Bedouin, something Arab, something Arabic about Shakespeare. And I'm going to Arabize him here, right? I think I'll stop here. I have another case, but I think I'm running out of time and I want to spend some time with you in Q&A. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Sameh, for a brilliant talk, and we have already received so many questions. Okay, let me start one by one. Dr. Clara Yu from Monash University. She has written, thank you for an inspiring talk, Professor Hanna. Could you please elaborate more on paratext or paratextuality as regards translation in an online environment? For example, crowdsourcing translation, user-generated translation, etc. Now, this user-generated translation, the boundary between the producer, conventionally the translator, and the user/consumer, for example, the reader, is blurred. Translators are the consumers themselves, translating for various reasons. It is a form of self-representation as well. To what extent or how can we examine translation process and reconstruct the relationships between production, dissemination, and consumption of translation in the digital space from the perspective of paratextuality? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that interesting and fascinating question, Rendon. Thank you so much, Clara, for that question. I did expect that. All I can say about that, because online translation and crowdsourcing is not my area, all I can say is that we have a number of theoretical challenges here. Of course, the concept of paratextuality, when it was first developed, it was developed within the context of literary production. So Jeanette, when he developed the context, he had in mind the traditional notion of textuality, a script, a text. Of course, that notion needs to be questioned and expanded on, because in translation and interpreting, in online translation, in audiovisual translation, the very notion of textuality itself becomes very questionable. We need to expand on it. What do we really mean by text? How can we define the text in simultaneous interpreting, in consecutive interpreting? How can we define the text in audiovisual translation? These are all very important theoretical as well as methodological questions. And that's why that field is open for all of us to try to step into it and try to engage with that concept theoretically at a theoretical level. We need to expand on it. We need to revisit it in order to make it applicable and relevant to forms of translation other than the textual. So in the case of online translation and crowdsourcing, there are huge challenges. Huge challenges when it comes to identifying the boundaries of the text, and huge methodological challenges in connection with the paratextual cues and clues, where these are, how can we find them, what kind of methodological assumptions we can embrace and use in order to reconstruct a field. And also, if I can add something here, we need to expand on the concept of paratextuality, and equally we need to expand on the concept of field. Because again, here we go. The concept of field within Bourdieusian sociology was developed not to serve our purposes in the field of translation and interpreting and online translation, but it was developed for specific purposes. We need to take that very notion and tailor it and play with it and add to it, and revisit it in order to serve our purposes in different translation contexts and settings. Well, thank you so much. That's a very important question.
Thank you, Professor Sameh. Dr. Rana Roshdi from Dublin City University. She is asking you, thank you, Professor Hanna, for the very insightful presentation. Do you think that paratexts can be used by translators to express an ideological viewpoint towards the text? You mentioned that norms are unconscious traditions. Does that make the translation strategies happen in vacuum? For example, that the translator does not make an informed decision? Does that reduce the norm to a mere issue of idiosyncrasy?
Thank you so much for that very interesting question, Rana, if I got the name right. Yes, absolutely. Paratextual framing can be used to communicate all sorts of ideological messages. And I needed some more time to share with you these two interesting cases of Othello in Arabic, Othello in 1916 and Othello in 1998, the same source text translated twice by two Arabic-speaking translators. And when you look at the front covers and the prefaces, you can see that these paratextual frames have been used to communicate two totally different ideological messages. In the first case, 1916, that case of Khalil Mutran, the preface was trying to sell, if you like, to publicize, to communicate a newly emerging ideology of pan-Arabism, secular pan-Arabism. At that time, the Arab world was suffering from colonization. And at that time, there was a massive movement of immigration from Lebanon and Syria at the time to Egypt because of different factors, including persecution and so on and so forth. So that man was trying to forge a new collective Arab identity, which he called at the time the pan-Arab identity. When you look at the 1998 translation of Othello, it was done using Egyptian colloquial Arabic. Mutran's was done in highly classical Arabic language, almost archaic, the language of pre-Islamic poetry. But the 1998 one was done in Egyptian colloquial Arabic. What was the ideological message? He was trying to question pan-Arabism, and instead he was trying to forge the Egyptian identity, questioning Arabness and replacing it with Egyptianness at the same time. And as you said, this poses this very fact that paratextual frames can have some subtle ideological messages. This poses methodological challenges for the scholar. And of course, the conclusion, what we read into the paratexts, need to be corroborated with some other forms of analysis. And this is something that I wanted to say in my conclusion, because the danger with paratextual analysis is that sometimes our readings into paratext can be quite subjective, especially when we talk about things like colors, the color of the front cover, like the design. Reflecting on these things can be quite impressionistic, to say the least, unless you try to corroborate your conclusions with some other ways of analyzing the translation, like reconstructing a field, like looking at the biography or the autobiography of the translator, if you are lucky to have any of these. So you need to supplement paratextual analysis with some other forms of analysis. I hope I tried to answer your question, but that's another important question.
Thank you, Dr. Sameh. The next question is from Professor Nivedita from Central University of Gujarat, Center for Translation and Comparative Literature. And she is asking, are the features of calligraphy retained in the post-print texts in the case of Arabic translations, especially in the case of translations from English? Has colonialism and the new educational system impacted such paratextual shifts in the case of the Arab world?
Thank you so much for that. That's another very interesting question. Of course, and that's why it's important to highlight this very fact about the changing function of paratext across time. The print culture, the way front covers are produced, the way the script of the Arabic language itself, it tells you something about the difference between different eras. So as we have seen with this front cover of the Arabic Julius Caesar, we can read some post-colonial tendencies into that. Nowadays, you can read a few things into front covers, which can tell you something about the mindset of the translators, about the code of practice of the publishing house, and about the dominant cultural norms within which the translation has been produced. Yes, so time changes the norms of the production, even the font size and the font shape.
Thank you. Next is Dr. Shashwati Shaha from Central University of Sikkim. She has asked, you mentioned how the word Arabized was used in the translation of Hamlet instead of Tarjuma. We have similar use of words in Bengali like Bongikaran or Banganubad, which can be roughly translated as Bengalicized. Do you think that there is a deeper politics of associating the language of translation instead of just using the word associated with the practice like tarjuma in the Arabic context or anuvad in the Bengali context?
Thank you so much for that fascinating question. And again, that's another area of research that there has been some work done within it, but there is a lot of potential for more research and more scholarship. And that area has to do with the very language we use, the very lexical items we use when we denote and talk about translation. And sometimes we tend to take these words for granted. Words like tarjama, words like Arabization, the words used in Bengali, sometimes we tend to take them for granted, but actually these words, these lexical items, if you look carefully into them, you can find a number of assumptions. And these assumptions tell you about the era when these terms were predominant, and they tell you about the code of practice of translation, the priorities and the norms of translating at the time. So as you said, in the case of the Arabic Hamlet, the word Arabization, as I mentioned, simply it meant domestication. Simply it meant trying to get rid of the foreignness of the source text. Trying to make the text sound Arab, in some other cases sound more Islamic, yeah? More or less trying to give the reader something that they can digest, something that they can easily make sense of without having to struggle with the foreignness of the source text. So that was implicit in the meaning of the word Arabization with that first case. With the later translation, 1916 and 17, Khalil Mutran wanted to change the terms of play, wanted to change the meanings of the words. To what extent he has been able to do that, that's a question for another piece of research. But later we could see that the word translation, the word tarjama, started to replace ta'rib. And the word tarjama, if you read into it, you can see some attempt of making translation sound more objective, an act that is not meant to appropriate or adapt or domesticate, but it is meant to translate the source text as objectively as possible. So there has been these implications in that term. So these terms, we shouldn't take them for granted. They have some assumptions behind them.
Dr. Shashwati Shaha has another question to you. In your case studies, we saw how words and adjectives were used to describe the source text in the title of the translated text. Such examples are also common in the translation that happened in colonial India. What does such practices of using adjectives say about the reception of the text in the target language culture?
So, sorry, what's the question here, Lyndon? I couldn't get it.
So in your case studies, we saw how words or adjectives were used to describe the source text in the title of the translated text.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, such examples are also common in translation that happened in colonial India. What does such practices of using adjectives say about the reception of the text in the target language culture?
That's wonderful. Yes. Again, in paratextual framing, we don't only read clues about the translation strategy, how has it been done, Arabization and all of that, but we read clues about the perception of the receiving culture of the source author and the source text. So as you have seen with that case of the Arabic Hamlet, seeing Shakespeare at that time as predominantly the poet, and encoding that, projecting that on the front cover, that, of course, that was meant to structure the reception process. And that links up quite nicely with some other pieces of information that you come across when you reconstruct that field. The information that the man who played Hamlet was himself a singer. He was a predominantly a singer before he became an actor later. Sheikh Salama Hijazi in Egypt. And for Salama Hijazi, because he was the director of the theater company at the same time, singing and monologuing had priority over dramatic action. And this is what we see in the translation of the monologue. The tension, the action between the private self and the public self of Hamlet is blurred, is taken away. And instead of that, we have a rhythmic and rhyming language that is meant to be sung. Again, if you trace that practice back to how Shakespeare was described on the front cover, you would be able to make sense of that. Why did they describe Shakespeare as a poet? Because for them, reception was mainly about singing. Singing was part and parcel of popular culture at the time. At some point, Sheikh Salama Hijazi was criticized by a few critics. They said to him, you change Shakespeare into a musical drama. So try to minimize singing in the play. He did that. He took away the singing in the drama. And in the evening of that performance, which was sanitized of singing, if you like, the spectators, the audience was so upset. They yelled at him on the stage and said, where is singing? Because that was a doxic practice. It was hard to do theater production without singing. And that's why highlighting Shakespeare as a poet, as the master craftsman of rhythm and rhyme, had a purpose for them, for the process of reception. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sameh. The next is from Dr. Upender Gundala from NIT Rourkela, Orissa, India. And he has asked you whether the ideology of the translator plays any role in the act of paratexts of translation.
Of course, yes. It's obvious. I mean, all of these cases, the 1911 translation of Julius Caesar, we can see clear ideology. And just to say that Julius Caesar is the least translated and the least staged of Shakespeare's corpus. And of course, the reason is obvious here. That's a very politicized play. Staging it, putting on the stage a leader who is assassinated by conspirators is a risky business in the Arab world. So that's the least translated and the least staged. but you can still see some ideological messages shared on the front cover, the dedication, and the way Shakespeare himself is described.
Professor Sarah Mariam from Central University of Kerala asked you that can you provide similar examples of translation of the Bible focusing on paratexts and its methodology?
Yes, in this case, you will need to invite me for another lecture.
Yeah, exactly.
But of course, yes, the paratext in Bible translation play a fundamental factor in establishing the audience for whom this translation is addressed, in establishing the process of reception. And you can instantly recognize that from the front cover, for example. You can know that this is a Bible for children from the front cover, from the colors, from the font size, the font shape, from the drawings. You can tell that this is a translation for not necessarily for Christians, but people from other faiths. You can tell that from the front cover, and you can see that in the introduction and so on and so forth. So definitely the same principles apply in different fashions, in different ways in the world of Bible translation.
We would like to extend advance invitation for this talk. When you will come for, as you have told me that you'll be coming in next year for some reason of United Bible Societies for some work, research work in India. So we'd love to invite you in Hyderabad and Odisha. Okay, so the last one from Marwa Ibrahim, and he has asked that if you have compared those translations of Shakespeare that you have discussed in your presentation to translations after 1950s, what is the main difference that you have noticed in terms of paratext?
That's a very nice question. Again, I need more time to talk about that. But that's a very interesting question that links up quite nicely with the whole idea of the dynamics of the field. The field is not static, it keeps changing, and the boundaries of that field keeps being challenged by different generations of producers of translation. 1940s, 1950s, if you look at the newcomers into the field, you will find that mostly they are academics. And this is unlike what we used to see in the early generation of translators of Shakespeare, late 19th, early 20th century. All of them were freelancers. Even if they were salaried, they were not academics. But starting from the 1940s, because of the very fact that many Arabic-speaking individuals were sent in academic scholarships to Britain and to US to have PhDs in drama translation and in theater. And when they came back, they kind of monopolized the translation of Shakespeare. So starting from 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s, it's kind of a subtle principle, a subtle rule. And that is, you're not allowed to translate Shakespeare unless you have a PhD with your title. So the players are different and the dynamics are different.
One last one, sorry. Chinmay Dhadukar asked that, since when the word tarjuma came in currency in Arabic, actually, in Urdu, there is a similar word in India also called tarjuma. And in Bengali, we have the same tarjuma. So he has asked, what is the, etymological root of this word, and since when this word is in currency in your language?
Well, that's another interesting question, yes. And we can do some collaboration about that, the semantics of the words we use for translation across cultures and what kind of assumptions these lexical items have with them. The word tarjama comes from the root rajama, and the word rajama in the dictionary means to speculate the future, to try to see into the future. This is one meaning of it. But the word tarjama as well has another meaning. It means the biography of an author, So when you say tarjama or tarjamat, you're talking about biographies, and that's a genre in Arabic literature. There's a whole genre around authorial biographies, if you like. And this last sense has some implication. The focus on the biography of the author, the intentions of the author, what the author has in mind. And that's why the word tarjama does have this connotation of objectivity, staying close and loyal to what the author has in mind when communicating the text. Of course, this needs to be tested and needs to be expanded on, but that's another interesting area of research.
Professor Kokila Kalelkar, just she has mentioned that tarjuma is also used for translation in Malayalam. So you can see in Bengali, in Urdu, in Malayalam, this is a very common word for translation. Okay, so I would request Professor Padikkal to reflect on this and to end today's session with vote of thanks.
Thank you, Rendra.
Thank you, Professor Sameh Hanna, for that really fascinating lecture on a topic that is paratext, which generally, translation study scholars or even readers tend to forget or tend to, not think about much. But you have brought, the paratextual importance of the paratextual, subject, paratextual elements very, very powerfully in this lecture. I would really, okay, thank you, because I personally, I have actually, along with my friend Professor Vanamala, translated the first Kannada novel into English recently. It was published by Oxford University Press, which had not only the cover page and all, inside also paratextual elements. Okay, earlier people used to publish it without those paratextual elements or the pages, which is in a way very, very injustice to the text, because though that paratextual elements were very significant, and author very deliberately, wrote and included them in the first edition when Basel Mission has published it in 1899. So I'm really thankful to you, grateful to you for giving such a wonderful lecture on this, and I hope I'm very sure that all the participants and our students actually enjoyed your lecture, and at least some of them will actually think of doing some research on paratextual elements. So on behalf of Sri Sri University and on behalf of Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies, University of Hyderabad, I thank you very much for this wonderful day and wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Padikkal, and thank you, Rendon, for extending the invitation. I'm really delighted to be able to share with you. And if there is any consolation in this current situation we are going through now, it is in these opportunities of sharing with each other and talking with each other and sharing research with each other. So thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Hanna, for accepting our invitation and giving us time for more. It is now almost, we have taken your almost 2 hours. So we are really
enjoyed
grateful.
That. That was fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.